Audio Renaissance presents A Time to Lead, For Duty, Honor, and Country by Wesley K. Clark with Tom Carhart. Read for you by Wesley K. Clark.
Preface, In the Line of Fire, 1970. Something touched my foot and I was instantly awake. I squirmed around to face a dark figure looming over me, the muzzle of my M16 still directed down the trail a few yards away through the jungle. He projected his voice in a stage whisper. "Oh, 5:30, sir." I turned and sat up, my eyes blinking in the dark. My answer was also a whisper. "Okay, thanks. Get the other platoons on the horn. Make sure everyone's okay." Other men were stirring around me, and I rose slowly up to a crawling position, stretching my arms and legs as I did. We'd been lying on the jungle floor for the past 6 hours, a platoon of about 20 American infantrymen, strung out some 10 meters back in the bushes from the edge of a heavily used path that cut through the thick underbrush. I was a captain and the company commander, but we had only 2 lieutenants to command our 3 platoons, so I was out with the platoon on this operation. We'd arrived at this place just before midnight the night before, and assumed an ambush position off the trail. Half the platoon had stayed awake, while the others slept for 2 hours. Then they reversed their roles. 50% security was high, but we were in the heart of enemy territory, and maintaining that level of alert was literally a matter of life and death. I was fully clothed and wearing my jungle boots, which were laced up and tied tight. That was another feature of sleeping in the field during Vietnam. No one unlaced his boots at night. It was okay to take off your helmet before you lay down. Then you just lay out flat, rifle at the ready, and try to stay awake while staring at the dark and listening to the night. And if you weren't extremely tough on yourself and everyone else, you fell asleep even when you thought you were awake. You were on the ground like any other large animal, save only that you had your rifle in your hands and ready for use. If I ever found someone with his boots off or web gear lying around somewhere where he couldn't reach into his ammo pouch at his waist and pull out the next 20-round magazine, I would have had to come down on him. But I'd found that personal fear was pretty good at keeping the discipline taut, and this morning the troops were a little anxious. I knew they all had their boots on. We were out to find the enemy, to interrupt his movements, to cause him to rethink his attack plans, and to hinder the assembly of his forces that could threaten Saigon. As a mechanized infantry unit, we ordinarily rode around on armored personnel carriers, APCs, or tracks as we call them. But here we were on the morning of February 19, 1970, hoping that the enemy would make the mistake of coming down that trail into the kill zone of our ambush. The previous evening, we'd set up the ambush about a half hour before sunset. We just backed into the jungle off the trail and lay down. The flank security hadn't even set up its defenses when I heard the rattle of a machine gun from the left. 2 long bursts, twigs and vegetation began to fall around me like rain as the rounds cut well overhead, then silence. Apparently, an enemy patrol moving down the trail had seen movement as the flank security took up their positions, and they'd opened fire to cover their retreat. But they didn't hit us, and we never saw them. We'd returned no fire, and I was pleased that the troops had maintained their fire discipline. I passed the word to reorient so as to provide stronger all-around security, and after darkness fell, I moved the platoon, because I didn't want that enemy force to double back and find us. We moved a couple of 1,000 meters up the trail, pulled off and set up a hasty ambush, waited and moved again around 10:30 p.m. to the overnight position. This was real, and the troops sensed it. This time, after I was woken up, I glanced left and right and lay back down. We were at the crucial time, just like hunting. The game would be moving around dawn, and every man had to be ready. The sky was still jet black, and I knew it wouldn't start to soften into gray for another 10 or 15 minutes, when the gray would fade to first light, fast. Then the sky would brighten above the jungle canopy as full dawn came, almost exactly at 0600 hours. We waited another hour to see if we'd have any action, but by 0700 there'd been no movement down the trail or in the jungle. Every man had been awake and ready to use his weapon for more than an hour, and it was time to move. I stood up, took a last sip from my canteen, chewed on a piece of date nut roll, and motioned to the men on my left and right, ready to move out. We still had a few minutes, and I looked around. All the men were up, silently adjusting their loads. There'd be no fires this morning, no heat tablets would be lit to boil water for instant coffee. As my men drank from canteens or took their last bites from sea rations, I went over our operations plan again in my head. I was with dismounted elements of the 2nd Platoon of A Company, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Mechanized, from the 1st Infantry Division. About 15 infantrymen led by their platoon sergeant, carrying rifles, grenade launchers, and one of the 2 M60 machine guns each platoon had. And I had my command group, my 2 radio telephone operators, RTOs, one handling the company net and the other the battalion net, plus a 4-man element from the company's long-range reconnaissance patrol. This team of 8 highly skilled, frighteningly fearless, and completely reliable soldiers, or LRPs as we call them, usually operated by themselves as an independent unit while performing various reconnaissance missions for me. They were the best men I had, and on this particular operation, I made sure that 4 of them, Sergeant William Bodine, Specialist Frank Juresh, Specialist John Gonzalez, and Specialist Mike McClintock, came along and stayed near me in case I needed their raw courage to get us out of a tight spot. We were not heavily armed, but we were very flexible, mobile, and we hoped able to move fast when needed. And on that early morning, we wanted more than anything else to fall on a surprised enemy force, pin it in place, and hammer it. In the winter of 1969-70, the 1st Infantry Division, commonly referred to as the Big Red One, was deployed as part of a defensive arc north of Saigon. It was expected that over the next few weeks, large Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army forces would try to make a major attack on Saigon from the north, just as they'd done in February of 1968 and 69. If that was their plan, we suspected they'd be staging the attack from an area of heavy jungle some 20 miles northeast of Saigon, a plot of ground about the size of Manhattan that had been a communist stronghold for many years. It was known as War Zone D, and the rough jungle-covered terrain was not crossed by any roads. Our job now was to try to make contact with a major enemy force by running patrols through the more open jungle just south of War Zone D. Once engaged, we knew we could use our heavy artillery and air support to pulverize them. But this did not turn out to be as easy as it sounds, for making the contact that would pin the enemy in place was not a simple task. As soon as we moved into the area to the east of Saigon, it became clear to me that the tracked and heavily armored APCs in which our soldiers rode and fought might not be the right way to reach the enemy elements south of War Zone D. In some regions, of course, this was the best way to fight the war, and we ran a couple of mounted operations with columns of APCs, usually accompanied by M48 tanks, crashing and smashing through the jungle. That's how we advanced most of the time. However, I often ended up having to put a dismounted jungle clearing team out in front, their job being to partially clear the way forward with axes and chainsaws. And while it seemed that there was almost no jungle terrain that our armored beasts couldn't plow through, and no enemy force that could stand up to their fearsome firepower, the thick jungle often meant slow going. But our vehicles were also loud, very loud. The thunderous, roaring noise of their diesel engines, coupled with the crashing of the trees and jungle undergrowth they smashed through, could literally be heard for miles. Since our goal was to engage the enemy rather than scare them away, I thought we might better perform this specific task by conducting patrols on foot. I discussed the matter with our battalion commander, and with his approval, that was the way A Company began to operate. In the early afternoon of February 18th, we launched this particular patrol, after having dismounted from our APCs a few hundred meters from the main highway that ran through Long Ton. These were left behind with drivers and gunners along with the company command post vehicles, while I took the dismounted elements of the platoon and my command group and moved north into the jungle on foot. This meant, of course, that we'd be leaving behind both the heavy firepower provided by the machine guns mounted on the APCs and the protection offered by their armored sides. But it also meant that our movement would not be betrayed by the unmistakable noise our armored vehicles made. In open country, a small infantry unit moves while spread out in a formation shaped like a roughly elongated circle, with plenty of firepower available front and rear, as well as to the sides. But in the jungle, this tactic usually wasn't practical and was seldom done unless enemy contact was imminent. If we'd used such a formation, we'd have had to move cross-country through the jungle. That would have been not only slow, but also difficult and noisy. In order to move effectively, therefore, we had to walk staggered out single file on one of the many trails made by the woodcutters in the area. And that became our common formation on patrol. While moving through the jungle, we usually spread out our columns so there were about 10 to 15 feet between men, with more space added if the vegetation thinned out. Normally, we moved with a couple of men up front, the first being the point man who walked on point, and a backup to reinforce him, known as the slack man, who was supposed to take up the point man's slack. After this point team came a few riflemen, followed by the platoon leader and his RTO, and if I were along, I'd be somewhere in the middle of the column behind the platoon leader. But in this case, we had no platoon leader, so I moved close to the front and I used my company sniper team as our point team to guide us through the jungle. When we went out on our first patrols on the trails south of War Zone D, we were all tense, ever alert to any noise or movement that might seem unusual. But unfortunately for us, we didn't make much contact with the enemy. And although we walked on many trails that seemed to be heavily used, we had only fleeting contact with enemy soldiers, a sighting through the jungle, a burst of fire exchanged, and then nothing. This was frustrating to say the least, but we were doing better dismounted than mounted, so we decided to continue the dismounted effort. That was what we'd done the previous day, and we'd moved steadily northeast on a large trail for some 3 hours. But our movement had been rather slow, and I estimated we were only 5 kilometers north of our start point, information I relayed to battalion when we stopped for the ambush. Now we were another 3 kilometers north and ready to move again. My company RTO carried the 25-pound radio in addition to his other gear. It was always turned on, and he kept it tuned to a frequency used by our battalion back in the Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, a logistics nerve nodule where our battalion commander was positioned with his field headquarters and staff, and that would be both the source of artillery and air support should I need either or both. As the men swallowed their last hurried bites of their breakfast, we were ready to go, and I had to keep the TOC informed of our location so they could keep artillery fires registered in front of us as we moved. I fumbled in my jungle fatigues for the CEOI, the Communications Electronics Operating Instructions. I kept it tied on a lanyard attached to my uniform. It was classified, and under the new system, we changed call signs every 24 hours, aware that the enemy could monitor our nets. That day, my random call sign was something like Hotel 6 Alpha for the company, and as the commander, I was 6-7. I held a handset up to my ear, pushed the broadcast button, and spoke softly into the microphone. Battalion knew only our approximate location, but if we got in a jam and needed artillery support, the first round fired would be white phosphorus, whose bright flash could be more readily seen than those of high explosive rounds. While from beneath the jungle canopy we probably wouldn't be able to see the bright flash these rounds made, I'd been in this situation before and was confident that just from their sound alone, I would be able to use the radio to adjust the impact of artillery fire until it hit on the enemy positions. It was already a beautiful morning. Bright blue sky, low humidity, Vietnam during the dry season. This was a strange feature of the weather in Vietnam. Near the equator, full daylight lasts almost exactly 12 hours each day, and there are only 15 or 20 minutes of gray dawn or dusk before the sun comes up or after it goes down. That balance holds steady through the whole year, whether the season is rainy or dry. One of the few reliable truths we could depend on, I mused, that of the sun's regularity all year round. Of course, during the rainy season, the bright sun was regularly obscured by everything from light clouds and mist to heavy thunderstorms. But we were in the dry season now, and as my men fell into their Indian file formation, ready to move down the trail, I felt good. We'd made contact. We'd moved. We were onto something in this area. The mission was find the enemy. We moved down a wide, hard-packed trail, sunlight splashing green all around us. I had told the point man to stay on a main trail headed generally to the north. We passed intersections with other wide trails. Was it only woodcutting in this area, I wondered. I looked at the vegetation for signs of movement through it and looked down for footprints, but the trails were smooth and broad enough for 4 men to walk abreast. We moved patiently, slowly, everyone on high alert, stopping every few hundred meters to send riflemen off to either side and check for enemy presence in the jungle around us. But there was nothing. Around 11:30 we found a small clearing, large enough for a helicopter to land, and I radioed in the location. That day I was to have lunch with the battalion commander at his operations center, get the update on the big picture from battalion, and review my plans in detail with him. The flight out and lunch were uneventful. A couple of hours later, I rejoined the platoon and my command group in the clearing in the jungle, and we began to move again. I planned to move a few more kilometers and then call the M113 armored personnel carriers that were the company's main transportation and weapons platform to pick us up in the late afternoon. That was the advantage of mechanized infantry, and I intended to use it. In and out, short foot patrols, and then back to the tracks. It kept everyone alert and avoided the kind of monotony that could lead to a fatal distraction. I was the fourth or fifth in the column when we crossed a 3-foot-long bamboo footbridge over a beautiful little stream. Then the point man halted and turned back toward me, beckoning with his hand. I moved up the column and was standing next to him as he turned and pointed forward. "Sir, the trail just ends right there." He was right. Suddenly the big broad trail vanished. There was thick jungle all around us. "It just ends right there, huh?" "Yes, sir, it looks that way." I looked forward into the vegetation. Nothing. I looked down at the compass in my left hand. We hadn't drifted off azimuth. Okay, I thought we'd just stay on course. We were bound to pick up a trail somewhere up ahead if we kept moving in the same direction. I didn't want to backtrack, and the jungle floor was flat. It wasn't going to be hard to simply move forward. I turned around toward my left to get the rest of the column moving. But as I turned, I sensed that I'd dropped my rifle and suddenly became aware of a loud buzzing noise. I was confused. I never dropped my rifle. Not ever. Cardinal sin. And the buzzing must be hornets. Had I hit a nest? As I turned back to get my rifle, I saw something small and white on the back of my right hand and glimpsed a dark stain on my jungle fatigue trousers right below the right knee. It was like my brain had been bypassed. "I've been shot!" I shouted, still in the act of reaching down for my rifle. "Get down!" Specialist Mike McClintock shouted back as he dove at me. He hit me hard and I went down, but as he knocked me out of the line of fire, a spray of bullets ripped the air above us, and I realized that he'd literally just saved my life. In that instant, he became my hero for all time. Without his courage and quick reactions in the face of fierce enemy gunfire, I would clearly have been killed right then and there. Flat on my face, I scrambled around and down the slight slope toward the bamboo footbridge. I was alive, and I was moving, though I couldn't feel or use my right hand or my right foot. My overriding attention at that instant, however, was focused on survival, as bullets were zinging overhead and ricocheting off the hard-packed earth. But a few heartbeats later, my training came flooding back, and my responsibilities as company commander took over. "Get the machine gun up! Set up a base of fire!" I had to shout the commands, and of course, that attracted more enemy fire. Sergeant David Bodine, the point man and head sniper, and Specialist Mike McClintock were with me there. McClintock a few feet in front and further up the slope. They were returning fire, and as I watched, a right-angle flap opened up on McClintock's jungle shirt, torn by a bullet as it grazed his back. I scanned left and right, hoping the enemy wasn't maneuvering around us. I could tell something was wrong with my foot. It wasn't moving, and I could clearly see the broken bone sticking out of my hand. I wasn't in pain, but I didn't really want to be right here, right now, not like this. For an awful instant, I remembered my 3-month-old son at home, my son whom I hadn't even seen yet. No, it wasn't going to end like this, and I suppressed the thought. Focus, fight, take charge. "Get that gun going," I shouted again, as I looked back under my left arm and saw the first troops come across the little footbridge. They were here, and they came running. Those peace symbol-loving, foul-mouthed, cussing, war-hating, drafty American soldiers came. They came right into the firefight. They rushed right into the smack of the bullets and the whine of the ricochets. They were called forward, and they came. God, I love them. The machine gun opened up, a long burst sweeping the jungle, and men joined in with their rifles as the incoming fire continued to pour in. In the deafening roar of battle, I hollered for the radio, and my RTO squirmed over to me, maneuvering his load and still trying to keep down. I called the battalion commander, reported our location, requested artillery fire, and asked him to help converge the other platoons on my location. Mass forces, cut off the enemy's maneuver. We had them fixed. Now we had to finish them. "Sir, stay still. You got a sucking chest wound. Don't talk." Suddenly there was a medic crouched over me, along with my RTO, both trying to hold me still as he wrestled a bandage around my chest. They could see the blood pouring out of my back, and just as they were trained, they were half risen up, risking their lives to try to keep me alive. But I knew it wasn't a sucking chest wound. I wasn't having any trouble shouting. I pushed them off as they protested. "Give me water, that's what I need." I gulped half a canteen. I wasn't thirsty, but I knew I was bleeding, and I didn't want to go into shock. This was my command, and I was in battle. The don't want to be here feeling was gone. I knew we could do this. There was still no sign of any enemy movement on the right as the incoming fire began to drop off. We had fire superiority now, and the machine gun continued to roar a few feet to my left. I heard the first artillery spotting rounds fall a few hundred yards deep in the jungle, artillery fire that would have to be adjusted by us over the radio so that it fell on the enemy's positions. Then there was what seemed like a long pause in the incoming fire. This was our moment. "Machine gun, shift fire to the left. You men on the right, on your feet. Move forward. Get them." And they did. They really did. They stood up. Men from South Texas and the Bronx and Kansas and California in a firefight in a jungle in Southeast Asia. Men who'd been plucked out of their lives, threatened with jail if they refused, some who held master's degrees, others who hadn't finished the 10th grade. They were firing from the hip and shoulder, a dozen men, moving into the jungle to sweep what turned out to be a small enemy base camp. This was my company. These were my men. And I was still flat on my face, struggling to keep the medic off of me so I could direct the fighting. Overhead, I could hear the distant whine of the battalion commander's loach coming in to take a look. He was on the radio, working to get the artillery and reinforcements into the area, while I was running the fight on the ground. This was how it was supposed to work. I could hear the shooting and my men's shouts as they swept deeper into the jungle. Now some 30 meters or more to our front, they began to move to our left front as the enemy withdrew in that direction. After having walked into their surprise fire, we'd now gained the upper hand and were driving the enemy before us. And though they were no longer even in sight, the adrenaline unleashed by this firefight was still coursing through my body. I was angry, happy, elated, determined, proud, embarrassed, but I knew I had to shut down the machine gun to avoid hitting our own men. "Cease fire!" And then the shooting stopped. It was over. Soon enough, a medevac bird appeared on station. They let down a jungle penetrator, basically no more than a strap on the end of a cable. My RTO and the medic roped me into it, and the helicopter hauled me up. As I rose, I looked down and saw the little piece of jungle we'd been fighting over. Didn't look like much, and I saw the men of my company for the last time as we lifted into the air. A strange mixture of feelings flooded through me as they waved and our craft rose. I tried to wave back at them, and I felt awful about leaving them behind. They were my friends and family. They were American soldiers. They did what needed to be done in spite of danger, in spite of fear, and for many, in spite of not wanting to be in the Army at all. They'd saved my life and overcome part of the enemy force. You had to have faith in us, in who we were and what we could do. Faith against the odds, faith against the wise-ass too-cool attitudes that seemed to dominate in the enlisted ranks but quickly disappeared in combat. Faith. God, I love those men, and I miss them already. As the helicopter pulled around and surged back toward Saigon, a medic began to work over my wounds. I felt the ache and the throbbing, and I knew this could get uncomfortable. But I dared to think again about my family, about my young son Wesley, and to thank the good Lord for helping us that day. Even in the worst of circumstances, I mused groggily as the helicopter climbed ever higher. Life can be very good indeed. Introduction. In this book, I want to tell you about leadership that works. Leadership as I've seen it in the armed forces as well as in the civilian world, and the leadership America has provided for so much of the world. I've spent my life working for the United States Army and our country. I've been shot at and wounded, scolded and threatened, promoted and rewarded in war and peace throughout my 38 years in uniform. Since then, I've continued to participate in public life as a businessman, author, TV commentator, and presidential candidate. I've seen successes and failures, good leaders and bad, but most of all, I've seen the critical importance of leadership in war, in business, and in the nation. The right leadership can turn a group of fumblers into champions. Without it, all American talents can be condemned to lose repeatedly or to engage relentlessly in efforts they can't possibly win. Leadership's about performance. That's the bottom line. It's not how you look, dress, or carry yourself. It's not whether you're short or tall, old or young, man or woman. Now, don't misunderstand, every attribute counts, of course, and everything matters. But in the final analysis, the distinguishing characteristic of good leadership is performance. To lead, whether it's in sports, civic activities, business, or war, you have to be competent. You have to produce. So leadership is to some degree about knowledge and skills. In sports, perhaps you must know how to read defenses. In civic activities, how to work a tax system. In business, how to read an income statement. In the Army, how to read a map and then issue an order. In the Army, we talk about the be, know, do model of leadership, according to which a leader needs to have some particular character traits as well as specific knowledge and skills, and then act appropriately for the situation and circumstance to get the job done. And leadership also involves personal interaction. As General Eisenhower said, leadership's about persuading the other fellow to want to do what you want him to do, although I've found that sometimes you may have to be a little more directive in your approach. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas during the 1950s, which was not only Doris Day America, but also the pre-civil rights, pre-Vietnam War, pre-social protest South. At the time, World War II veterans had come home to establish themselves in a traditional society, though they were also concerned about the new threat to our country posed by communism during the Cold War. I went to college at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, during the middle 1960s, and then spent 2 more years at Oxford University in England, where I saw social protests and anti-Vietnam War passions expressed up close and personal. I went from there to Vietnam, where I served as an infantry company commander in combat, which allowed me a close look at drafted soldiers, a real cross-section of America, and the ways they handled fighting in what was increasingly becoming an unpopular war. After coming home wounded and logging some time in the hospital, I decided to stay in the Army, a personal adventure that seemed to almost rush by for another 30 years. I was fortunate to have had what was really an exciting career. As everyone does, I started by laboring in the vineyard, but slowly rose until I finally found myself dealing with important national issues and making a difference both in people's lives and in our nation's future. I held 23 different jobs, spent 5 years in various schools, taught college-level economics and political philosophy, served as special assistant to a member of President Ford's cabinet, filled various Army staff roles, and led ever larger groups of soldiers. I ended my military career as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, a role first filled by General Dwight D. Eisenhower after World War II, with the main variation being that I led U.S. and Allied forces to victory in the first war they fought. During those years, I worked with some wonderful people and faced a variety of challenges, all the while growing and expanding my horizons. In short, it was a thrilling ride. It included just about everything one could seek in life, save only assured personal safety, wealth, material comfort, and extended periods of leisure. Travel and temporary residence in a variety of communities, of course, were key elements of that life. I lived with my family in 31 different residences, ranging from a trailer through apartments and houses and all the way up to a chateau in Belgium. We lived in America's heartland, Kentucky, Kansas, Texas, California, as well as in Germany, Panama, and Belgium. My wife and I worried about schools, medical care, housing, public safety, and of course money, of which we never had very much. But what we did have was opportunity, the opportunity to lead soldiers, to help families, to change organizations, to watch and learn as various scientific and technological tools were developed and applied, to see America and the world, and then to take all these experiences back into America's business community and into the political realm. I want to share with you a selection of my experiences and some of the lessons I've learned. Expertise and competence, self-control, establishing goals and setting standards, teamwork, and respect for others. But I'd be the first to say that these lessons were learned as functions of the people and of the situations from which they were drawn. They reflect the America I've known, what it still stands for, and how it's changed over time. So this is a leadership story about America. I'm proud of our country and of our institutions. Most of all of the people I've served with or met along the way. And I'll be as objective as possible and direct, but this isn't theoretical. It's personal, and it's as accurate as I can make it. I'm going to tell you about successes I've had and some of the problems I've faced, and an array of issues that have troubled me. I hope you'll read it as a story of growth, in the sense that healthy people and sound nations change and develop. As my wife Gert used to say, if you're the same at 40 as you were at 20, then something's wrong. Everyone's changing, and hopefully changing for the better through growth and personal development all the time. Part of being a leader is being willing to stand up and speak out. In this book, I'm doing just that. We need a deeper, more honest dialogue in America today. a dialogue about who we are, what we believe in, and how we ought to proceed in the world. Our nation's at war, and our armed forces are fully committed. But we won't find a positive end to this war and win a lasting peace unless we really understand who we are. And even though we are at war, the country is really being asked to give up very little. There have been no great tax levies, no mobilization of our youth, and no harnessing of our enormously productive and innovative potential, despite the public focus on Iraq. We've been distracted politically from the general discussion of our future, including our challenges as well as our potential, and how we should move ahead. In consequence, we've neglected a whole range of concerns, like substandard education, a woefully inaccessible health care system, aging infrastructure, no national energy policy, slackening environmental safeguards, and that's not the right way to face the future. Today, the United States finds itself at a difficult juncture as the most powerful country in the world, embroiled in two simultaneous wars and subjected to a terrorist threat, and ever more deeply engaged in a dynamic global economy which will challenge America's preeminence, our long-term prosperity, and our own character and values. I'm appalled by the ineffective ways in which the Bush administration is trying to handle the problem of Iraq and the regional threat posed by Iran. I worry that America has lost much of its legitimacy in that part of the world, and I have a plan to help us recover it. And I'm most concerned that we find ways to keep the door open for ordinary Americans, people like me, so that they might have their chance to live the American dream. But ultimately, winning peace and recovering our influence in the world may well come down to defining who we are as a nation and as a people. In order to succeed in our 21st century struggle to protect America, we must ask ourselves some tough questions. Who are we? What do we believe in? And how must we proceed? This book is a journey through the main events of my life. You'll read about my youth growing up in segregated Little Rock, through West Point, Vietnam, Europe, and my presidential campaign. These experiences, both difficult and rewarding, provide a basis for understanding the challenges we face as a nation, and hopefully will help us find the right path on which to move forward. 1. Strength from Adversity, 1944-1958. My mother, Vanita, was my best friend when I was little, and everyone said she was beautiful. She could whistle, too, so all the other boys in the neighborhood were a little jealous. Her father was Robert Stetson Updegraff, born in 1878 to a family of Dutchmen who'd come across with William Penn. His father and grandfather had worked timber across Ohio and Missouri, but his mother died when he was a boy and he left home early, escaping an angry stepmother. When he ran away, he'd been through only a few years of schooling, but he followed his father's line of work, which meant the mills and forests of South Arkansas. Vanita's mother was a Reynolds, and she had blood ties through them to the Upshaws and Longs of Georgia. Thomas Wesley Reynolds, my great-grandfather, was the engineer who claimed to have built the first bridge over the Arkansas River at Dardanelle, some 80 miles upstream from Little Rock. But it was said that the Reynoldses lost their money in the Depression of 1893, and my grandmother was pulled out of private school in the 3rd grade. Robert Stetson Updegraff eventually worked his way up to become a sawyer, a position of some authority in a sawmill, and he married my grandmother, Elsie Reynolds, when she was 16. My mother was born in the small village of Ava, Arkansas, on the 11th of November, 1906, the second of 5 children. The Updegraff family never had much. They didn't own a home or even a car. Granddad's reading ability was quite limited, and he silently moved his lips as he traced the line across the page with his finger below the print. But he did have the gift of being mechanically inclined, and he was a hard worker, and he and grandmother made sure their children finished high school. Mom graduated from Monticello High School, 100 miles south of Little Rock, in 1923. Monticello was a county seat, and a number of wealthy families lived there in beautiful homes. Their daughters often went to finishing schools in the East, spent summers in Europe, and if they chose, went on to college. The boys from Monticello High School whose families could afford it went to the University of Arkansas, or Tulane, or Vanderbilt, or to fine colleges on the East Coast. Mom married a young man from the wealthy Bogart family, and they settled in Little Rock. But the marriage quickly failed, and my mother soon found herself alone and adrift in Little Rock. She was young, divorced, and almost penniless, but she was not without spirit. Like many other young women of her time, she decided to move to a big city, where a capable young woman could get a job based on talent rather than family. She decided on Chicago. She quickly found a job there as a secretary in a bank, rooming with her friend Lois in an apartment hotel on the south side of Chicago. She met a handsome man, a lawyer who worked as assistant corporation counsel for the city of Chicago, and they fell in love. Eventually, though they were of different faiths and he was almost 10 years older, they were wed. They wanted children, but after 7 years of marriage, they'd pretty much given up on that dream. Then, as Mom used to joke, she thought she had a tumor, but it was me. In December 1948, I was not quite 4 years old, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night, then walking around in the apartment. There were a lot of adults standing there talking, but I didn't know what was going on. I wanted to go into my parents' bedroom, but the adults wouldn't let me. My father was a big man, and he was warm and kind to me. I used to ride in his lap as he drove the car through the park, and he often bought me a present when we were out together. He took me out with him every Saturday morning to visit his friends, and he even took me to see the White Sox play baseball in Comiskey Park. Now I wanted to know why everyone was in our home in the middle of the night, why Mom was so upset, and why I couldn't go into the bedroom and see my daddy. I was looking up at them, but they were holding me back and trying to distract me. I wasn't taken to the funeral. I later learned that when Benjamin Caney died of a heart attack at age 51, he left his good name, a diamond ring, a 1940 Buick, and about $400 in cash, and that was about it. There was no insurance, no trust, no other property. My dad had died and left my mom and me pretty much alone. At the age of 42, my mom was a widow and had a 4-year-old son to support. She got back her old job as a secretary in the bank, and I was shuttled off to a nursery school for 8 hours a day. I'd never been around many kids, and now there were kids everywhere, and they didn't seem to mind the food or the discipline or to miss their homes like I did. After a few weeks, Mom realized this wasn't working, but she never lost hope. Hope and spirit, that's what I remember about her. She gave up her job in the Chicago bank, packed our clothes into the Buick my father had left us, and drove down through Illinois, across Missouri, and back to Little Rock, her home. When we arrived, we moved in with her parents in a little rental house on West 13th Street. Mom had kept her old resourcefulness. She could type and take dictation, so she soon got a job as a secretary in the Commercial National Bank. She lied a little about her age to get the job, telling them that she was just 40, and they paid her about $25 a week. I was now a Yankee, living in Dixie, and I had a strange name, Caney, and no father. Granddad was still working on and off at age 71, still looking for saws to sharpen and adjust at Mr. Dirks's lumber mills. Grandmother took care of me, but there were other grandchildren too. After a long summer, Mom arranged to buy a house using my father's eligibility for a loan under the Veteran Administration, a nice 2-bedroom home on North Valentine Street in the Pulaski Heights area. It rained hard that October day we moved in, and I remember standing on the front porch and watching as someone brought a pot of coffee over for us. The neighborhood was filled with kids, and I found playmates in nearly every house. But I missed my father. Other kids talked about fishing with their dads or going to ball games or even just playing catch. But I didn't have a father to take me fishing or to baseball games or anything else normal dads did. Mom was one of the only working mothers around, and because of that, she didn't socialize much in the neighborhood. We didn't have much money, though she never mentioned it. And there were other differences that I felt every day. They all thought I spoke strangely, and I'd picked up a speech defect that further marked me as being different. Even as I played and had fun and ran with my friends through their yards and homes, I felt a strong urge to really belong. But through all the confusion and occasional loneliness, my mom was my best friend. She worked hard to provide for us, and we really didn't have much, but she made do. During the first year or so we were in Arkansas, when it was almost time for her to come home from work, I'd go up the hill to Kavanaugh Boulevard and wait for her at the bus stop. I especially remember that when I was 4 or 5, I took a quarter from her purse. She noticed it was gone right away. In 1949, it was probably her lunch money, and she asked me if I'd taken it. I admitted that I had, and she told me to put it back and never again take anything that didn't belong to me. I was so ashamed. She never spanked me, and I never tried to steal anything again. The old Buick, though, wasn't doing too well. So my mother saved her money, and in September 1950, she bought a new car for $600, a 2-door maroon-colored Dodge. It was the year-end stripped-down model, with no radio and a standard 3-on-the-column transmission, but we were proud of it. It was about that time that Granddad got hit in the eye by a splinter as he was fixing saws for Mr. Dirks at the lumber mill. He lost the eye, and we visited him in the hospital, where they put in a glass eyeball. But after he came home, he gradually slipped into the unhappy state of being old, poor, and out of work, and he no longer seemed to get out much. There was no kindergarten at the time, and when I was 5, I started first grade at Pulaski Heights Elementary School. My mother took me to school that first day for registration, and when they asked after my father, she said, "He's deceased." I knew what she meant, and I choked up. My first grade teacher, Mrs. Tolliver, took a broad view of her responsibilities, and we were expected to learn and participate in class, and she made sure we knew about the world. This was during the first year of the Korean War, and there was a lot of concern about the action over there. When General of the Army Douglas MacArthur was relieved of his command and later addressed the U.S. Congress, we heard it live on radio in our classroom. His words were spooky and confusing as he concluded, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." I wasn't sure what that meant, but the reference to death I clearly understood, and it was a formulation that nagged at me. It seemed a little frightening at the time, but I finally understood that this was just his artful use of rhetoric. Mom always made sure my clothes were clean and neat, but I was a lot of trouble. My feet were too wide and they were flat, and so I had to have special shoes. And they were the big clunky kind that you bought at special stores, the places where you put your foot under a fluoroscope that showed the bones inside. And then there was my speech defect. I knew I couldn't say "stop Spot" or "run Randy run," and I called my neighborhood friend Wibby Ann instead of Libby Ann. I guess people thought my speech defect would go away by itself, but it didn't. And in the second grade, I was taken once or twice a week downtown to the old MacArthur House on 9th Street, which had been converted for special education. There a nice teacher had us read as she listened closely. She taught us how to form our lips, and we got prizes if we pronounced words correctly. And sure enough, after a few months, my speech defect was corrected. Looking back on that later, I realized I was a kid with special needs, but I was able to get the appropriate special education that made things right for me. Because I benefited from it personally, I've always been a strong supporter of this particular special assistance many of our youngsters receive from our public school system. The kids in the neighborhood became lifelong friends, but as we played together, I really missed having a father. I missed some of the activities other kids had with their dads, and there were tears at night. But it was the kid talk that really hurt. Kids in the neighborhood would talk and brag, "My dad did this. Well, my dad, he can..." And then the inevitable, "Well, my dad could beat up your dad." My mother would occasionally go out with a man at night, and I would later often ask, "Is he going to be my dad?" But nothing ever seemed to come of it. Then one night when I was 7, my mom let me fall asleep in her bed because she was going out. And I awoke from a dream in which I was holding a big hunting knife. And then I looked, and in my left hand was the most beautiful hunting knife I'd ever seen. It was in a scabbard with a long blade and a beautiful curved brown and white bone handle. And Mom introduced me to the man she'd been out with, who'd brought her back to the house and put the knife in my hand. "Honey, this is Vic. Thank him for giving you the knife." Gradually, Victor Clark grew into an important force in my life. He was a banker in his early 50s, and he drove a big Mercury. He would take us both to the drive-in movies, and later on he taught me how to hold and shoot a pistol. He even took me fishing. He taught me how to bait a hook with minnows and worms, and how to cast a line. He had a tackle box filled with the most amazing lures. Lazy Ikes and roadrunners and jitterbugs, incredible rubber frogs with hooks sticking out of them, and popping bugs with whiskers and feathers. Best of all, he told wonderful stories. How his Uncle George had fought a mountain lion in her den, and how he'd caught big Appaloosa catfish weighing up to 100 pounds with his bare hands. He also told me how when he was young he'd played football and basketball, had boxed, had been very good at swimming, diving, and gymnastics. He was 5'9", but he told me, "Kid, I've got arms like a gorilla and hands like meat hooks." These weren't made-up stories either. He'd played semi-pro basketball, and he could palm a basketball, dribbling it low and fast with either hand, and do what I now know was a running dunk. He could walk around the room on his hands, swim like a fish, and sprint really fast. He was like a dream come true as a father. Would he be my father, I wondered. "Can I call you Dad?" I asked one day. His eyes became moist with tears as he said yes, but there were issues. He was married, but was estranged from his wife and grown son in Texas. His job in Arkansas called for him to travel and socialize and win deposits from Arkansas banks for his big bank in Dallas. And he drank. A lot. Jim Beam was always around, on the fishing trips and in his apartment and wherever we went. And there were emotional scenes, like when he told Mom that his wife Mary wouldn't give him a divorce, something that both enraged and frustrated him. He and my mom seemed to argue a lot, but they always made up. He bought me model airplanes. He took me outdoors with him. He was good to me, and I loved him. In 1953, he entered a sanatorium in Missouri to dry out for a few months. Then he moved back to his parents' farm in Berryville, Arkansas, and did manual labor there for another few months. In the fall of 1954, he finally got his divorce. He'd long given up his big banking job, but at least the Jim Beam was gone. He married my mother in November in Greenville, Mississippi, and he moved into our home. Grandmother and Granddad moved down to Monroe, Louisiana, to be with Mom's little brother, my Uncle Ray. And at long last, I had a father. I soon began to call myself Wesley Clark. But there were still problems. Dad always seemed to be upset, and it seemed he didn't or wouldn't eat much. He had a job representing Investors Diversified Services, one of the first mutual funds. He drove all over the state trying to sell funds, but unfortunately, he just couldn't do that. He knew too many people, it seems, and they remembered him from when he was a heavy drinker. Even his old friends wouldn't buy from him. Mom and Dad had no social life and very little money. Dad wanted to go to Northwest Arkansas, where he didn't have a reputation, and start all over. Dad described a place in the country where I could have a horse, and I was all for it. There'd be hunting and fishing every day, just like the way he'd grown up. I was 10 or 11, and I got pretty excited about it. But Mom didn't trust his ability to earn a living, and she refused to move. She wouldn't give up her job, and she wouldn't give up my education. There was a lot of Bush Bavarian beer drunk, and a lot of shouting and crying. Dad even slept in his car for a few nights, but we didn't move. The truth was, Mom had gotten pretty invested in my education. Year after year, she'd encouraged me to study hard, and she made sure my A's were rewarded. She bragged about my studies to the girls at work, paraded me through the bank, and even clipped out the newspaper columns listing me on the honor roll. Mom was what in the South we call sweet or nice, but she also knew her own mind. I came to understand that though she had to juggle everything, my welfare was going to remain the top priority. She didn't train me or coach me or try to teach me skills. She just loved me, and I felt it very deeply. What I really wanted to play was basketball. Dad put up a hoop for me above the garage door, and I practiced faithfully. Free throws, layups, dribbling, the two-handed jump shot. I was always after Dad to teach me, practice with me, play with me. I could beat some of the kids at horse, and I could dribble, but I wasn't a star. And one day when I was 11 or 12, Dad broke the hard news to me. Kid, you're never going to be a great basketball player. You just don't have what it takes. You need to find a sport you can be good in, something you like swimming. And so the Clark family was surviving in Little Rock, Arkansas. A working mom, a troubled dad, a new marriage, an anxious child, love, hope, dreams, difficulties. That was the Clark family in 1957, struggling to make our way. There are a lot of families like this across America. Certainly even more today than when I was growing up. If there's a father at home to set an example, that's good. But it still takes strong mothers to make things work. This is especially the case with single mothers, whose numbers among us have grown dramatically over the last few decades. Having grown up the son of a single loving mom, I can tell you, women in her situation from my own personal experiences, just how crucially important you are in the lives of your children. The bonds of love that build up between a single mother and her child can become the bark on the tossing sea of life that will carry those young souls safely to a future port of success and happiness. And your high expectations matter enormously to your youngsters. It's a force that can truly have a life-changing effect on them. Trust me, I was there, and I know. Over the past several decades, women in America have won an enormous new freedom to reach their true God-given potential in many areas, often in fields that were simply closed to them during my youth. Doctors, lawyers, firefighters, police officers, business leaders, they're no longer barred from these once male-dominated areas, and life has been open to them in dramatic and important ways. Indeed, though I can never know the answer, I sometimes wonder how far my mother would have gone had she had access to the range of opportunities open to American women in the 21st century. I'm sure she had been an outstanding business leader and enjoyed a more satisfying professional life and would still have given me the love, friendship, and support I needed so desperately. But I worry that not every single mother has the kind of family network my mom had. As a nation, we need to help our single moms with childcare, cooking, cleaning, and the opportunity to advance their skills, and all the other support that's so easy to take for granted. For me, the 8th grade was a watershed year when a lot of lessons came together. Little Rock was in the national news because Central High School was going to be desegregated. The plan had been to start from the top down, high school first and then junior high, and eventually the elementary schools. There was a large crowd of angry whites at the school, and only one black girl showed up, and she was chased away. It was on the evening news that night in black and white. 8th grade was a time for growing up, all the more so because throughout the country the reputation of our town was damaged and tarnished. There was a picture in Life magazine of a man who'd been chased at bayonet point onto a porch near Central High. Somehow his arm had been cut open and there was blood, and this picture was just the most egregious of a daily savaging by what today we'd call the mainstream media. We're not that kind of town, my parents said. There are nice people here, but if you just go by what they're saying about us, you'd think we're the worst people in the world. It was the anger of Southern whites, a refrain that dominated much of American politics over the following years. But these were good people, I believe, respectable, church-going, at least some of them. And here they were on the wrong end of all this publicity. It was true there was a Supreme Court decision that schools had to be desegregated. But white Southern community leaders and opinion makers would say that Little Rock wasn't the only place with problems. And anyway, I heard, we treat ours better in the South than they treat theirs up north. Here we like them as individuals, while up there they don't. And what about property values if they start buying homes in our neighborhoods? It was confusing to many of us in the 8th grade. The Arkansas National Guard was first called out to prevent blacks from going to school. Then some federal troops, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, were sent in to bring them into the school, and the Guard was federalized and made to switch sides. Sure, the African American kids had a right to go to school, and the law was the law, but why was it being enforced here and nowhere else? Why was our community judged so harshly, and why did my parents and so many others seem to be opposed to what was happening? Was Faubus, our governor, a hero or a villain? What was right? And what if my parents didn't agree? Mom and Dad had never said anything bad about African Americans, except that Dad didn't like Elvis Presley on TV, wiggling his hips and making their kind of music. But I remembered he'd introduced me to the African American barkeeper at the Arlington Hotel in Hot Springs one night when he was hosting a bankers convention there a few years earlier, and the bartender and I had had a real conversation. It seemed like almost everyone but my family had an African American maid. They rode the bus up Kavanaugh Boulevard in the mornings, always in starched white uniforms, walked down the street, stayed in my friends' homes all day. Little Rock was deeply segregated. The swimming pools were just for whites, and in public places there were separate facilities, even separate drinking fountains. And of course the Pulaski Heights Baptist Church that I attended had no black families. The buses did carry both blacks and whites, of course, but the blacks were sent to the seats at the back in a marked-off section. This problem in Little Rock was a personal conundrum. I knew what my parents said and believed, and I loved Mom and Dad, but I also sensed they were wrong somehow. If it took all that much wriggling around to defend competing ideals, then maybe, just maybe, something wasn't right. We still played Dixie at football games as a school fight song, but it no longer felt right. Mom always said her favorite song was the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and I think she was trying to tell me something. For years, I struggled to make sense of the conflict. I loved and respected my stepfather, but my stepfather, like so many others, was wrong. He was a good man, but good people can be wrong, utterly wrong, despite their sincerity, their fervor, and their wisdom in other areas. It was simple prejudice against black people that they felt. There's just no other term for it. I saw prejudice at an early age and came to dislike it in all its forms. Maybe I was acutely sensitive to it, since I'd come to Little Rock from Chicago. Over the years, I've seen prejudice against blacks by whites, prejudice by Northerners against Southerners, and by Southerners against Yankees, by jocks against nerds, by the educated and snobby against the undereducated and poor, by liberal intellectuals against the military, by Irish against Italians in New York City, by Serbs against Muslims in the Balkans, by conservatives against liberals on talk radio and various TV news programs, by straights against gays, and every manner of religious prejudice. Most of us carry some form of prejudice inside. Today, though, most Americans feel as I do, that everyone should be treated equally. Sometimes it's difficult for us to see our own prejudice because it's hidden in institutions, habits, traditions, or in language itself. But when it's pointed out, it's almost always corrected. Sometimes it takes a little while for their corrections to come through, but they have, and I believe they'll continue. And this is one of the greatest attributes of our country. We try to live by the very standard of equality that we professed 230 years ago in the Declaration of Independence. But for many people, such corrections come too late. I believe no one should be denied a crack at a team, a neighborhood, a school, or a job because of race, ethnic group, gender, religion, or any other unfair discriminator. Because of this, I am a strong believer in affirmative action. Despite the social unrest at Central High School on the other side of town, my junior high school life went on. Acting on Dad's advice, I found a swimming team I could join, downtown at the Little Rock Boys Club. Most of the Boys Club members were poor kids who lived downtown. Membership was 75 cents a year, gradually rising to $3 per year when you were 16. They had an indoor pool, and there were several other kids at Pulaski Heights Junior High on the team, and you could win a school letter. After a few weeks, practices had begun to seem routine. It meant skipping supper or eating alone, but it got me out of the house and away from the arguments and criticisms that passed between my parents. Even though my dad was recovering from his drinking problems, there always seemed to be issues between my parents, and I wanted to be among the best of the new swimmers. We were all 12 years old, and I had little to offer beyond hard work, but I hung in there. The big test was to be part of the annual pilgrimage to swim against the freshman team at Northwest Louisiana State College at Natchitoches. It would be a full weekend trip. We'd leave before dawn on Saturday for a 4 or 5 hour drive, swim Saturday afternoon, stay over in the college Saturday night, and make a long ride home Sunday. Everyone talked about how much fun they'd had last year on the same trip. But our coach was a determined young man. Growing up poor in southern Arkansas, Jimmy Millard had a hard youth. In World War II, he'd fought as an infantryman at Guadalcanal. After he got out of the service, he eventually put himself through college on the GI Bill while working as a coach at the Boys Club and starting his own family. And he wanted a winning team. He gave each of us the times we had to meet to make the travel squad with the team. He read them out to us one evening in practice as we sat cold and huddled on the steps beside the bleachers at the pool. For the 100-yard freestyle, I had to beat 1 minute 12.4 seconds, while another boy on the team, Mike Stewart, had to go 1:12.5, so we knew what was expected. But that seemed unfair to me because Mike always beat me in practice. I thought maybe Coach Miller had gotten us mixed up. At the next practice, I asked him why my time had to be faster than Mike's, even though he was a better swimmer. "Because you're stronger," he said. On the night of the dreaded time trial, Miller called us up 2 by 2. I was paired with Mike Stewart. Mike had a sunny, confident disposition, and we all liked him. He always seemed to say the right thing. Then Miller told us the rules. "You'll all make your assigned times, and if you don't, you won't go on the trip. And just to make sure, you're going to get 1 pop of the wet towel on your fanny for every 1/10 of a second you miss your time." He cracked the thin, wet towel against the tile floor. It sounded like a rifle shot. So we began, with the youngest going first. Most of the boys made their times, though one 10-year-old missed his by 2/10. "All right," Coach Miller said to the unfortunate swimmer, "bend over and grab your ankles." Crack! Crack! The boy came whining back to the steps to sit down, rubbing 2 red spots on his rear end. By the time he called up Mike and me, I was concerned and not at all confident. "Take your marks." Tweet! He blew the whistle, and we dived in. 2 prepubescent boys engaged in a titanic struggle to make the trip to Natchitoches. We had to swim 5 lengths of the pool. Mike was a body length ahead of me, his feet thrashing a steady beat. My arms felt like lead. I seemed to just sink in the water. I was incredibly tired. Mike finished well ahead of me, and Coach Miller looked up from his stopwatch smiling. "Mike, you've done well. You made 112.5 on the nose. You're on the trip." Then he frowned down on me as I stood in the chest-deep water. I looked up, my eyes filled with disappointment and fear. "Son, you didn't make it. You missed your time by a full second. Get out and walk down to the other end of the pool." I was feeling so sorry for myself that his voice seemed to come from down a long tunnel. I got out of the water and moved to the indicated place. "Now bend over and grab your ankles." 10 pops. They stung. Tears came to my eyes. I'd failed, and I was publicly humiliated. I turned around, head down, to go back to the steps and nurse my feelings. It was very quiet. But Coach Miller stopped me. He asked quietly, "You know what your biggest problem is?" "No, sir," I said. "It's you," he replied. "You didn't believe you could do it. Now go sit down." After a few more swimmers made their times, practice was done. There was excited chatter in the car going home, but not from me. I had a problem. I was going to be left out of the trip, rejected, different, failing, couldn't even make the swimming team, and my rear end still stung from the towel. The trip was scheduled for the following week. At Wednesday night's practice, the last before we left, Coach Miller announced, "I'm going to give a couple of you another chance." He called me up by myself, alone. I felt nothing as I stood at the edge of the pool. No fear, no worry, just nothing, numb. But when I hit the water, I swam. I swam hard. I wasn't tired. My arms weren't heavy. I didn't sink. I just swam. I slapped the wall and looked up. I knew it was good. Miller smiled a little. 111.7, he said. "So you did it, just like I knew you could. You were the only one who didn't know it. Now you do. Now get back over there and sit down." That was what I came to learn from Coach Miller. Mind over matter. He forced you to change your mind, to change how you saw yourself. He forced you to believe that you could be more than you were. He did it by bullying, threatening, humiliating, and only occasionally explaining. Maybe he learned that in that draft army of 1942, or maybe he learned it through the School of Hard Knocks, or maybe it was just him struggling with himself. But whatever it was, he had a kind of magic for me. I've always been around young people, in the military or teaching or at the Boys and Girls Club, or at the swimming pool or applying for internships or working in political campaigns. And I always wonder if anyone's ever taught them what real potential is inside each of them and how much they can achieve if only they will ask it of themselves. I can't teach it with a wet towel, of course, and I wouldn't want to. But Jimmy Miller gave me a great gift, and in my own way, I've always tried to pass it on. That same year, the Soviet Union launched the first Sputnik. The launch sent a chill through America at the time, and for many of us, it became a significant marker in our lives. Of course, I'd been aware of the Soviet Union already. I had memories of the Korean War and Stalin. I remembered doing duck and cover drills at our desks and the urgency of marking civil defense air raid shelters. I remembered vaguely the discussions about our needing to go to war with the Soviet Union before they could create an H-bomb like ours. And I remembered, too, the vicious fighting and terrible reports of torture as the Soviets suppressed the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Now they were surpassing us technologically. Was America lost? But instead of panicking, America went to work. Yes, we lived with the fact that missiles were aimed at our cities and that nuclear annihilation was possible. But we didn't give in to our fears. New legislation was passed promoting the study of science and technology. And American industry and our educational systems were updated to meet the challenge with research and development tax credits and the National Defense Education Act. I was one of several thousand youngsters who did what we could to catch up by learning about rockets, some of us even trying to build our own in the backyard. Soon the United States did launch its own satellites, and America wasn't invaded. In fact, less than 40 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed without our ever firing a shot against them. For so many of us who lived through that time, international challenges have to be answered, but with confidence that we can prevail. In the 1950s, America didn't take counsel of its fears and wage preventive war, even though some recommended it. And so from an early age, I have believed in our country's resiliency and strength, and our ability to surmount any challenge by drawing on our courage and creativity and not giving in to fear. Our country's leaders owe it to us to make sure that the children we're raising today do not grow up with dread, but rather with hope and optimism for the future. Our children must not be raised in fear, whether of Osama bin Laden or anyone else, nor be left without some opportunity to help our country. 2. Finding a Purpose, 1958-1962. In Little Rock in those days, the 9th grade wasn't actually high school. It was the last year of three-year junior high. And in 1958, that was a very significant distinction because in late August of that year, the Little Rock School Board voted to simply close the city's two high schools, the famous Central High and the brand-new Hall High, located on the western edge of town, rather than submit to mandatory school desegregation. Over 2,000 high school students were displaced by the decision, unable to attend classes. In the 9th grade at Pulaski Heights Junior High School, my friends and I were totally unaffected. My boys' club friends Randy Treese and Danny Herbie were star halfbacks on the football team, with the popular Jerry Bass as end and place kicker. Cy Dunn was the star runner in the quarter mile. His 55-second 440 was one of the top times in the States. There were school dances, and Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper were still competing with Elvis and the Platters. Many of the kids were going steady, and I'm sure that most of the rest of us had crushes that we kept largely to ourselves. The most advanced were getting their learner's permits at 14 and sneaking out with the family car on weekends. For me, it was mostly about swimming with the team at the boys' club. We began training early in the fall to compete in the Phillips 66 meet in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. I was also editor of the school newspaper, the Tip-Top Times. Our schoolwork was pretty standard: algebra, civics, English, first-year Latin, general science, physical education. Most weekends, Mom would drive us down to Stuttgart, about an hour and a half east of Little Rock, to join Dad in the bait shop, Clark's Worm and Cricket Ranch, that we'd bought the year before with a few $1,000s I'd received when my father's mother, Ida Caney, died in Chicago. "Kid, can we use your money for this?" he'd asked. Of course I said yes, and the money covered the down payment for the bank loan to buy the business. It had given Dad a sense of hope and purpose in his life, and we desperately wanted it to succeed. My job was to tend the crickets in the worm beds and pack them for sale, 25 to a 50-cent box. In this I worked with Joe, a young African-American, who was a couple of years older than me and knew what he was doing. We had a lot of fun talking in the shed while sorting out the red wrigglers and African nightcrawlers that local fishermen liked. Occasionally I would also help Dad wait on the customers. But the separation was a further strain on my parents' marriage, and the business was totally dependent on weather. It had been a struggle from the very beginning, marked by rainy weekends, strange infections of the minnows, and some petty thievery by Dad's one full-time employee, Jim. I could overhear Mom and Dad's worried conversations at night and knew the business wasn't living up to Dad's expectations. Still, Mom always found money for Christmas. That year I was given a Remington .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle with a 4-power scope. As Dad said, every boy needs his own rifle, and he'd gotten his first rifle at age 6. I was proud of the Remington and occasionally used it to hunt rabbits and squirrels while Mom and Dad fished. But beneath the surface, our homes were churning as parents watched the older kids struggle to find a place with relatives out of town or gain last-minute attendance to private schools, including some just opened makeshift schools in Little Rock. Some of the kids were talking about Lawrenceville, Andover, or Sewanee. My mother began to talk private school for me, out of the state, perhaps a military school. We had just enough money left in the small inheritance from my father's mother to pay for 2 years of private schooling. We sent away for the catalogs, and I studied them closely. Kemper, Columbia, Culver, too expensive, and Castle Heights. Ultimately, it would be Castle Heights in Lebanon, Tennessee. I took an entrance exam, and we sent in a large deposit. With friends on the swimming team, there was always a lot of talk, and much of it was about America and the Soviet Union. There seemed to be an overwhelming sense of competition, and we were emotionally connected with it, even as 13 and 14-year-olds. I found my way over to the University of Arkansas Medical School Library, a mile away on Markham Street, where they were said to have textbooks with which I could try to learn Russian. and got serious about mathematics and science at school. Through the National Defense Education Act of 1958, money was already being disbursed to strengthen U.S. science instruction, even in Little Rock. I was invited to join the after-school Federal Radiation Project, where along with a few other hand-picked ninth graders, I could raise and irradiate fruit flies and learn about genetics and advanced biology. The summer was glorious, with swimming meets almost every weekend. At the Boys Club camp, Miller trained us 3 times a day in the 25-meter pool, and at 14 I was at the top of my age group and doing well in meets around the state. And despite the 3 hours a day in the pool, for the first time I was given real leadership responsibilities. 14 boys in my cabin. I had to know about them, coach them, meet their parents, and make them successes at camp. From reveille at 6 a.m. until lights out at 9 p.m., they were my charges. Some I taught to hit a baseball or swim. Others I taught to stand up against bullying. I looked after mosquito bites, poison ivy, and homesickness, and I was really proud of them when they won ribbons in the camp competition. 3 terms of 2 weeks. It was some of the best leadership experience I've ever had. At home, Dad had found an alternative to the bait shop in a job with the Arkansas Civil Service in the Revenue Department, and we managed to recover most of our losses in the bait shop by selling it. And then, all too soon, it was Labor Day weekend, and a long, slow drive across Tennessee to Castle Heights. Mom and Dad came with me into the main hall to register, and I inquired about my schedule. I had to be able to take calculus in the 12th grade. In the catalog, Castle Heights showed a calculus class, and not even the Little Rock schools taught calculus. I wanted that class. It was somehow connected in my mind to patriotism and doing my part for the country. And to get calculus, I knew I'd have to double up on math as a sophomore, taking plane geometry and algebra 2 the same year. "No, that's not on your schedule," the woman said at the registration desk. Then they brought me in to see Colonel Bradley, the dean, who explained that doubling up on these courses wasn't normal. Particularly for someone with my background and test scores, he wouldn't advise it. Mom and Dad were silent as we left his office. Not 5 minutes later, we ran into Jerry Bass, my junior high friend who was also attending Castle Heights, and in passing he mentioned he was enrolled in both Algebra 2 and plane geometry. I was stunned. I turned right around and went right back to the dean. With Mom and Dad standing there, I argued that I, too, should be allowed to take both math courses. And at that point, there wasn't much he could say, and I got the class schedule I wanted. As Mom and Dad drove off, I was instantly homesick. It was like an empty feeling in my stomach, a kind of an ache, and a longing that I fought to keep under control. It seemed to hit me the hardest as I walked up the long steps to the 3rd-floor room where I was assigned to stay. Fortunately, once the school year started, there were lots of activities, good teachers, the swimming team, and my roommates, David Bixler and Reed Johnson. We put up with a little harassment and hazing from the upperclassmen, and some tough, white-gloved Saturday morning room inspections, but we were busy. In addition to class, I had swimming team trips all over Tennessee and Georgia, a good Baptist church to walk to downtown, and close friends both on the swimming team and with other Little Rock boys. It was a military school. We wore uniforms and shined shoes. I didn't particularly like the regimentation, though with the daily swimming practices and study in the evenings, there was a purpose in the routine. But I did find the daily formation around the flagpole for retreat a somber and beautiful ceremony. What was it like, I would wonder, to actually be in the service and to fight for that flag? I watched the real soldiers and sailors in uniform at the bus stations on my way back and forth to Little Rock. Mostly they looked lonely and sad, just the way I would find myself late at night in those bus stations. And I wondered about the purpose in their lives. For I was discovering purpose in my studies and in my leisure readings of Toynbee and Plato, about the rise and fall of civilizations, of leadership and government. Would America survive, I wondered, and what would it take to make a difference in her future? It was the faint sense of purpose that seeped out from beneath the questions that seemed to make the pain and the loneliness go away. Eventually, after a lot of political noise, the Little Rock high schools had opened that September. After another summer in Little Rock, then, I had to give serious thought about whether or not to return to Castle Heights for the 11th grade. I talked it over with Mom and Dad. I went to visit the guidance counselor at Hall High School. She promised me that they would have a calculus class for us when we were seniors. So Jerry Bass and I agreed to attend Hall. I was surprised by the exhilarating sense of freedom I found that fall. Somehow I had more time to pursue my priorities, and I had no difficulty maintaining purpose, even in the seductive world of sock hops, Friday night football, and dates to the Frost Top root beer or West Hall's Minuteman hamburger shop. Above all, it was the quality of the students that made the school. We had a little over 300 in our class, and I was proud to know almost every one of them. Even though the smartest boy from junior high, Johnny Billheimer, had stayed at Andover, there were plenty of others who, like me, were interested in rockets and mathematics, as well as in sports and girls. Together we made up the calculus class, and with a sympathetic teacher, we basically taught ourselves through analytic geometry and into differential and integral calculus. Members of that class were also the presidents of the student council and the senior class, and most of the extracurricular activities in school, as well as captains of 3 varsity teams and the king of the high school homecoming. And they were smart. That year we learned that our class at Hall High School, proportional to its size, had perhaps the 3rd highest number of National Merit Scholarship semifinalists in the nation. Some of these friends went on to Harvard, MIT, Rice, Washington University, Columbia, and Dartmouth. They were then, and still are, the group with which I was probably most closely bonded.